A shrill alarm cut through the stillness of the neonatal ICU. In the low glow of medical monitors, Jonathan Miller jerked awake in his chair, heart pounding. His eyes flew to the incubator where his son Lucas lay. The tiny infant's chest wasn't moving. No, no, not now. Jonathan's mind raced as he realized Lucas wasn't breathing. Panicked, he stumbled to his feet and shouted for help. A white uniformed nurse in the corner froze, wide-eyed and unsure. But before Jonathan could shout again, Nurse Aisha Brown burst through the sliding glass door, already snapping on a pair of gloves. Her dark eyes were laser-focused on the limp, blue-tinged newborn. Jonathan's stomach clenched. Her, the very nurse he had barred from touching his babies just hours ago. His first instinct was to push her away, to refuse her help even now. But another beeping monitor shattered that impulse. His other twin, Jacob, was now in distress too, his heart rate spiking dangerously high. Both babies were in crisis and every second mattered. Aisha gently but swiftly moved beside little Lucas, her hand steady as she lifted the tiny boy. "Come on, baby, stay with me," she whispered, voice calm but urgent. She began neonatal CPR with practiced precision, 2 fingers pressing delicate compressions on Lucas's minuscule chest. Each second stretched like an eternity as Jonathan hovered helplessly, tears blurring his vision. Across the room, Jacob's monitor blared. A fever spike, possible sepsis. The white nurse fumbled with the phone to call a code, panic rendering her nearly useless. Jonathan stood paralyzed between his sons, torn and terrified. In that critical moment, all of Jonathan's fears and prejudices wavered. The only person decisively fighting to save his children was the woman he had shunned. He watched in anguish as Nurse Aisha breathed gentle puffs of air into Lucas's tiny lungs, her expression fierce with determination and compassion. Would it be enough? Jonathan's world teetered on the edge as Lucas finally gasped weakly under Aisha's care, while Jacob lay in peril, awaiting her healing touch. In the chaos, Jonathan realized the life of his children rested in the very hands he'd tried to reject. If you believe compassion can overcome prejudice, subscribe to see this story unfold. Earlier that day, the intensive care nursery had been eerily quiet. Jonathan stood over his fragile newborns, Jacob and Lucas, their tiny chests rising and falling beneath a tangle of tubes and wires. Just 48 hours ago, he had lost his wife during the twins' birth. Now, all he had left in the world were these 2 infant sons fighting for their lives in a high-end Atlanta clinic. The NICU's machines hummed softly, a cold reminder of how fragile life was. Jonathan had spared no expense to ensure his children got the best care money could buy. But he never expected that one of the nurses assigned to them would be someone he didn't trust on site. When Nurse Aisha Brown gently approached the incubators that afternoon, Jonathan's posture stiffened. Aisha's reputation had preceded her. Other staff spoke of her extraordinary skill and calm under pressure. She had recently transferred from an underfunded public hospital, where she had seen every neonatal crisis imaginable. But Jonathan barely heard those praises. All he saw was a stranger he wasn't comfortable with, a young black woman in colorful scrubs, with a warm smile that he refused to return. His grief and fear needed someone to blame, and unconsciously, he'd chosen her. "I'll take it from here," Jonathan said tersely as Aisha reached to adjust one twin's IV line. His voice was raw from lack of sleep and simmering distrust. Aisha paused, meeting his eyes with a slight furrow of concern. "Mr. Miller, "I'm just checking little Jacob's catheter to make sure it's secure," she explained softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'd prefer the senior nurse do that," he replied, casting a glance toward an older white nurse across the room. The comment hung in the air, curt and tinged with an unspoken bias. Aisha swallowed and stepped back respectfully, hurt flickering across her face for just an instant. The head nurse had tried to intervene, assuring Jonathan that Aisha was one of their best. But Jonathan's mind was firm. "My children have been through enough," he insisted. "I want someone more experienced." The unspoken sentiment was clear to everyone. Jonathan was wealthy, grieving, and used to being in control. And his prejudice, whether he admitted it or not, had been awakened. Aisha had seen that look before and knew exactly what it meant. Still, she maintained her professionalism, determined not to let pride interfere with caring for the infants. She offered a polite nod, even as her heart ached at being judged so unfairly. As evening fell, Aisha completed her day shift tasks quietly in the periphery. Though Jonathan had all but banned her from tending to the twins, she couldn't help observing them from afar with genuine concern. She noticed baby Jacob seemed a bit listless, his skin warmer than it should be. Twice she considered mentioning it, but Jonathan's earlier rejection echoed in her mind. Instead, she gently advised the night staff to keep a close eye on Jacob's temperature and breathing, just in case. As she gathered her things to go, Aisha cast one last compassionate glance at the babies. She whispered a silent prayer for their safety, hoping the night would be uneventful. Jonathan settled in for another long vigil beside his sons. He sat in a cushioned chair between the two incubators, exhaustion weighing on him like a lead blanket. In his hands, he clutched a photograph of his late wife cradling her pregnant belly, taken just weeks ago in happier times. Guilt and sorrow warred within him. "I have to protect them," he thought, his eyes burning with unshed tears as the lights dimmed. He told himself he was doing everything right, hiring the best doctors, staying by their side. Yet, in pushing Nurse Aisha away, he had unknowingly dismissed the one person most prepared to save his family. And as the clock inched towards midnight, the stage was set for a test of faith and prejudice that neither of them saw coming. Have you ever seen someone let prejudice cloud their judgment in a moment of need? Near midnight, the NICU lay in hush and shadow. Jonathan's head dipped forward as exhaustion finally overtook him, his hand still resting on Lucas's incubator. Across the ward, the night duty nurse quietly checked another infant, unaware that behind her a silent crisis was unfolding. In the dim light, little Lucas's breaths grew faint, each one weaker than the last, until finally they ceased. For a moment, there was only the soft whir of machines. Then a flatline tone shattered the silence. Jonathan jerked awake to the piercing alarm. His heart dropped as he saw Lucas's tiny form unnaturally still, the monitor tracing a dire flatline. "No, Lucas. Breathe, son," he cried, voice cracking as he leapt up. He slammed his palm on the glass of the incubator in a frantic effort to rouse his baby and yelled for help. The older nurse on duty rushed over, but panic froze her at the sight of the blue infant. Her hands hovered uselessly above the incubator as she fumbled for the code alarm with trembling fingers. At that split second, the NICU door flew open. Nurse Aisha, who had been finishing late paperwork in the next room, burst in at a full sprint. Without hesitation, she gently moved the stunned night nurse aside. "I've got him," she said firmly, already cradling Lucas's limp body in her hands. Jonathan's throat tightened with a mix of relief and fear. Would she be able to save him? Aisha laid Lucas on a warmed resuscitation table and quickly tilted his head back to open his airway. "Starting CPR," she announced, her voice steady. 2 fingertips pressed down in precise rhythm on Lucas's tiny sternum as she counted softly. 1, 2, 3, breathe. She lowered her face close to his, giving a delicate puff of air into his lungs. Jonathan hovered at her shoulder, shaken and helpless. He wanted to grab his son and will life into him, but he forced himself back, knowing he had to trust the nurse he'd shunned. His knees threatened to buckle beneath him as he watched those critical seconds tick by. After 2 tense rounds of compressions and breaths, a weak sputter came from Lucas. Then the miracle sound, a thin, reedy cry. Aisha let out a breath of relief as color slowly returned to the baby's cheeks. Lucas was breathing again. Jonathan clapped a hand over his mouth, tears of gratitude welling up. "Oh, God, thank you," he whispered, his whole body trembling. For the first time, he truly looked at Aisha, not with suspicion or resentment, but with hope. But their ordeal was not over. A shrill wail from the other incubator pierced the air as Jacob's monitor went berserk. "Temperature 104 and rising," shouted another nurse who had rushed in. Jacob's tiny form convulsed in a series of jerks, a febrile seizure. The on-call pediatrician hurried in just as Aisha turned to her second patient. "Doctor, I suspect sepsis," she reported urgently, already lifting feverish Jacob into her arms. The doctor nodded, quickly issuing orders for antibiotics and cooling measures. It was Aisha's swift hands that slid the IV into Jacob's vein on the first try, her calm voice continuing to soothe the infant. "I know, little one, I know," she murmured as Jacob whimpered in pain. She placed an oxygen mask over his face and gently dabbed his burning forehead with a cool cloth. The doctor prepared an injection of broad-spectrum antibiotics, but Aisha was already a step ahead, disinfecting the port and securing the line so the meds could flow as soon as they were ready. Jonathan stood back, pressed against the wall, his hand over his heart as he watched the scene unfold in disbelief. The room swarmed with activity now. A respiratory therapist had arrived to tend to Lucas, and 2 more nurses assisted Aisha with Jacob. Yet Jonathan only had eyes for the nurse who was saving his sons. The very person he'd wanted nowhere near them was now their guardian angel. Minutes felt like hours. Jacob's rapid heart rate gradually slowed as the medicine and Aisha's cooling efforts took effect. The seizure had stopped, but Jacob was frighteningly still, his body exhausted from the ordeal. Aisha refused to give up. She massaged the baby's tiny arm and spoke softly into his ear, encouraging him to hold on. "You're a fighter, Jacob. Stay with us, sweet boy," she whispered, her tears held in check by sheer will. At last, Jacob stirred with a faint cry. His oxygen levels inched upward, and a healthier color began returning to his face. "He's stabilizing," the doctor said, offering a grateful glance at Aisha's capable work. A collective breath of relief filled the room. Nurses smiled at one another, and the tension eased as it became clear both twins were out of immediate danger. Jonathan wiped his wet cheeks with the back of his hand. He approached Jacob's incubator on unsteady legs, peering down at his son who was now resting quietly with monitors still attached. An incredible wave of gratitude and guilt crashed over him. Just hours ago, he'd thought Aisha unworthy of touching his children. Now those very hands had snatched them back from the brink of death. "Thank you," Thank you so much," Jonathan managed to say, voice broken and sincere. His eyes met Aisha's, searching for the right words. Aisha gave a modest nod, her face gentle as she replied, "I'm just glad they're okay." In her eyes, Jonathan saw no resentment, only concern and kindness. That made his chest ache even more. He had been so wrong about her, about everything. In that moment, Jonathan understood the full weight of his mistake. His prejudice and pride had blinded him to the person most capable of helping his family. The very nurse he had pushed away was the one who gave Jacob and Lucas a second chance at life. He had nearly let prejudice cost him everything he loved. If you believe he's truly learned his lesson tonight, subscribe now. A pale dawn light began to creep into the NICU hours after the crisis. The worst was over. Lucas slept peacefully, recovering under gentle sedation, and Jacob's fever was finally under control. Jonathan sat between their incubators, head in his hands, replaying the night's events in his mind. He glanced up to see Nurse Aisha nearby, quietly disposing of used syringes and adjusting IV drips with care. She had refused to go home even after the emergency passed. Jonathan realized it was because she still cared. She wasn't going to leave the twins' side until she was sure they were safe. Summoning his courage, Jonathan stood and approached her. His throat felt dry, but he spoke anyway. "Nurse Aisha?" She turned, a bit apprehensive, not knowing what to expect. The harsh, guarded man from yesterday was gone. In his place was a humbled father with red-rimmed eyes. "I owe you an apology and so much more," Jonathan said, voice low and earnest. "I was wrong, terribly wrong." He struggled to continue as emotion threatened to choke him. "I judged you before I even knew you. I didn't trust you, and I was so wrong." His eyes dropped to the floor in shame. "My prejudice nearly cost my sons their lives, but your compassion saved them when they needed it most." Aisha's expression softened. She took a step closer and gently shook her head. "You were scared," she replied. "People make mistakes when they're afraid." She didn't excuse his behavior, but her tone held no bitterness. "What matters is that your boys are okay." She offered a faint, reassuring smile. Jonathan looked back at his sleeping infants, his voice trembling. "I can never repay you for what you did. You saved Jacob and Lucas when I almost pushed you away." His eyes glistened with tears of regret and gratitude. "Thank you for looking past my behavior and caring for them anyway." Aisha blinked back a tear of her own. "They're strong little fighters. I'm just glad I was here," she said softly. For a moment, both of them stood in mutual silence, watching Jacob's tiny chest rise and fall steadily. The only sounds were the gentle hum of equipment and Lucas's quiet snuffles. Wiping his eyes, Jonathan managed to shake his smile. "My wife would have thanked you too, from the bottom of her heart." His voice wavered at the mention of his late wife, but he continued, "She always believed in judging people by their character, not by anything else. I think, in trying to protect my kids, I forgot that. But I won't forget again." In that exchange, forgiveness was granted without another word. Jonathan extended his hand, and Aisha accepted it warmly. It wasn't just a gesture of thanks, it was a promise of trust. By noon that day, once both twins were fully stable, Jonathan insisted that Aisha remain as the primary nurse caring for Jacob and Lucas. He made sure the hospital administrators heard how her steady hands and calm expertise had saved his children's lives. In the weeks that followed, As the twins grew stronger under Aisha's watchful care, Jonathan often found her by their side, humming lullabies or gently holding their tiny hands during feeding times. He realized he had found not only a nurse he could rely on, but a true guardian for his family. As the first rays of morning sun filtered through the window, Jonathan felt a profound change within himself. He had learned a lesson in the hardest way possible, a lesson he would teach his sons as they grew. Compassion can save lives where prejudice fails. With Jacob and Lucas safe, Jonathan finally allowed his exhausted eyes to close. He knew his babies were in caring hands. And for the first time since his wife's passing, he felt something other than fear and sorrow as he drifted to sleep. He felt hope.